Boker Tov, everyone. Rabbi Eric Solomon here once again for some morning Torah. It is Sunday, April 19th. This week, instead of just focusing on the Torah portion and let me adjust a little bit here. Okay, on the Torah portion, is also Yom HaShoah. We're coming up the next day or two, which is the State of Israel established it, but it's the day in honor and remembering those who sadly perished in the Shoah. In Israel, it's also called Yom HaShoah Ugvura, which is also those who are heroic and fought back against the Nazis as well. So I want to dedicate a few teachings this week in honor of Yom HaShoah. Specifically, I want to talk about Eli Wiesel's teaching, that may rest in peace, Alav Shalom, who actually is a distant relative of mine according to family lore. I haven't proven it, but it seems likely given that my grandmother on my mother's side, maternal grandmother, Jean Lanter, Aliyah Shalom, was from Siget, the same shtetl, with this we know for a fact, from where Eli Wiesel was from. So in his book, Night, which if you haven't read, I highly, highly recommend it, particularly this week. It's a short book, painful book, part of a trilogy he wrote about his Holocaust Shoah experience. Shoah is the word that we use in the Jewish community for the Hebrew word for Holocaust. He shares a story that is just, numerous stories, but this one is penetrating. Some of you who've read it will know this well. He tells a story early on in the book about how one day, and he was young, probably a teenager during the Shoah in Auschwitz. One day, three Jewish prisoners were going to be hung. I don't think he explained why exactly, if I remember correctly, what the reason was. It doesn't matter. They placed the gallows, 3 nooses. They parade or place all the prisoners or significant up in to watch, witness, for all the reasons you can imagine why the Nazis did it. And there are 2 adult men and 1 boy. And he describes that as they are being hung and the nooses are dropped, and the 2 men, adult men, died relatively quickly because it broke their neck, it asphyxiated them. It's horrific. But he describes how there was a young boy who was not big enough or heavy enough to die immediately, and therefore he struggled with breathing he described for a half hour. It's unimaginable. A half hour struggling to breathe between life and death. And they forced the Jews to watch, basically, and parade in front of this as they watched him die in this suffering. In this, he describes the crowd watching, where someone says, "Where is God?" Looking at this horrific scene, indescribable, and someone else responded, "There he is, hanging on the gallows." Here's my points. Eli Wiesel has so much profound teaching to offer, coming from suffering, immense suffering, beyond word suffering. First of all, my read of when he says, "Where is God hanging on the gallows," is first and foremost that is a legitimate spiritual and theological response to seeing absolutely inhuman, destructive, there aren't the words to describe it, in this crowd, which really is in all of us, when we see ultimate suffering. One of the natural responses, especially for those of us who have a relationship or feel that God exists, and whatever that means, believe in it, experienced it, struggle with it. The idea is that we can say, I don't believe God exists right now. I look at the situation. How can God, if there's a God, how can this be? And letting that out and expressing it is profoundly Jewish and profoundly okay. And Elie Wiesel essentially is saying that this is, forget about whether it's even natural or okay. It's human. This doesn't make any sense in a world that many of us want to think has God up as a part of it, even as just creator. And that is a legit critique to offer from a religious perspective. And as we know, he was quite religious, even with his own struggles. He held on to both tradition, Jewish tradition, and in a relationship with God. That's first and foremost. That doubt, that struggle, that pushing, that rejection, that crying out, that anger at God. That's all kosher. That's number one. And number two is that in times of suffering, in a time where it appears that the world is completely upside down, where death, inhumanity, immorality seems to be winning, and I was okay to question it. That view of God as the one who comes in and establishes and takes care, intervenes, makes sure that the world, that this won't happen, and the theological understanding, right? This is rooted in the Torah. Okay, this is old school religion. Okay, that if God exists, how can God let this happen? Particularly for those that would take the traditional theological to God's people, God's chosen people. How can God let this happen? Another read of this, and this is by other theologians, that Richard Rubinstein most famously said, not that God as an entity or an idea is dead, but that kind of God. Yitzhak Greenberg says that kind of God belief is dead. It's hanging on the gallows. Those are the two reads. Now, I want to say that we can absolutely take this into this current time, because there are people right now who are questioning, how can God exist under this suffering moment? How can God let this happen? I don't want to compare it to the Shoah. There's nothing, it's incomparable. But the Shoah teaches us, Elie Wiesel teaches us, that it's possible to call out and rage even against God, for those of us who do have that relationship. That is kosher. It is okay. It's okay in one's prayer to say, God, why are you letting this happen? For those that have that kind of theological connection. But it's also okay to say that that kind of theology is done. Perhaps it should have been gone before, but definitely perhaps now. And the problem is that there are some people who are doing, I've heard this term used, theological malpractice. One of them I've heard some of these are within the Jewish community, I'm embarrassed to say, but also within some of the conservative evangelical Christian community. You hear them in America. One that pains me the most is Franklin Graham. Comes from, there's so much potential there in the Graham family. And Billy Graham, not someone who's perfect for the Jewish community, but someone who did amazing influence amongst bringing a sense of God, morality, love, a message of love to so many, and to see his son. But when there's blaming, when you take this moment and you say, the reason why this is happening, I know the reason. It's because certain people are sinning and they are not following, quote unquote, my view of God's law. And therefore, this is a punishment of society or this particular people who don't believe in me or who practice whatever this person's decided. That's theological malpractice, not only because I believe it's fundamentally wrong, not only because I think that view of God, as Elie Wiesel put, is hanging on the gallows, but it's also hurtful. It's hurtful to decide that the reason why this is happening is because there are Jews who don't practice a particular form, let's say, of Orthodox religious practice. Or there are those who have a sexual identity that is different, or those who, whatever, have a belief about pro-choice, abortion, whatever it may be. Even if you believe fundamentally that this is not what you think your religious practice offers, and you even believe that this is not what you think God wants from us. Who are you? Who are you to decide and to share and to inflict on others? Let's make this clear. I don't want to put this as absolutely within the Jewish community. There are ultra-Orthodox rabbis who will say that conservative rabbis like me, or Reform rabbis, we are the source of suffering in this world, including what's happening now. This is why God, quote unquote, is sending down a punishment. This is the plague. It's hurtful and it's dangerous. That type of God view needs to die. When Jacob changes his name to Israel, it's a famous story in the Torah. There's a wrestling with an angel. In the end, Israel means one who wrestles with God. His name was Jacob, Yaakov, Yisrael, one who, and Arthur Waskow famously wrote a book called We the Jewish Community Are God Wrestlers. What Elie Wiesel said, in my view, and what I think is profound here and from the Jewish community, is it's okay to be a God wrestler. It's okay to have doubt. It's okay to question. It's okay even to rage. What's not okay is to decide you're so clear on your God belief that you're going to inflict it on others. We know whose fault this is. It's the people who are liberals. It's the God wants to punish the ones who don't keep the Shabbat, whatever it may be. God forbid. Whatever happened to love your neighbor as yourself? Whatever happened to, who are you? Are you God? Who are you to decide who's the one who's responsible? Okay, so come back. In honor of Yom HaShoah, which is coming up in a few days, in honor and dedication to Elie Wiesel, who is a great tzaddik, a great righteous person, in this moment, what those who survived the Shoah can teach us is that in moments of suffering, it's okay to struggle, to rage, to bring that into our prayer, to question, and to even say, perhaps I need a different theology. My belief profoundly is God didn't cause this plague to come down to pick and choose. That idea, again, which has some history, I'm not denying that, in a Jewish tradition, but it's hanging on the gallows. We have to understand differently what God means to us. Perhaps in our future sessions we'll explore that further. But bottom line, we can't let whatever our God belief is punish, hurt, pinpoint. Not only is that dangerous, literally, physically, violence could be inspired by that, as we've seen in the past, but it's hurtful. Let each and every one of us struggle to make meaning out of the suffering moment. I believe, my belief, is that God is that source that helps us to find meaning in the struggle. And my blessing and hope for you, in honor of all those who taught us like Elie Wiesel, is maybe there's a God now, if it hasn't before, a God belief that needs to go to the side. And maybe we need to bring forward a God belief, a God understanding that makes more sense to us, given the suffering of the world, the suffering of our past, and even the suffering now. And being in that conversation about it, even praying with just a conversation about that struggle, that is a prayer. That is enough. I wish everyone, please God, a good day, a sweet day, a healthy day, but a day we don't see God as punishing us through this. We see God as perhaps a source to give us strength, to find meaning in this, and to find love in this, and not to attack others in this. Boker Tov.